Well, hey folks, it's your old pal King Waspinator. Welcome back to Total Party Skills. Last night I finally watched the first episode of Lord of the Rings of Power, and I guess here are my thoughts on the subject. Right off the bat, to get the elephant in the room out of the way in regards to the quote unquote diversity casting. I probably wouldn't have noticed it as much if the cast and crew had not engaged so much with that particular question during the lead up to the release in terms of press junkets and online media and stuff. But because such a deal had been made out of it from both sides of fandom, it ends up like really standing out every single time you see anyone of any non-Northern European ethnicity in there. And I can't help but notice, because of the fact that ended up being something that you kind of end up thinking about while you're watching it. That while, there's a sprinkling of diverse casting amongst the main characters, most of the background extras are all very white, so it's just kind of weird that there's this one black elf, or, this town of poor humans, but there's the one black lady, or there's the 1.5 black hobbits, and the rest of them are all lily white. It seems weird. It's something akin to some of my complaints about how D&D's Forgotten Realms has become, where it's just kind of recreating America's racial demographics in fantasy worlds, which why not go to the trouble of actually coming up with land appropriate areas for the setting where you can then have this cast have emerged from, instead of just there's just always a small population of any white settlement that has some black people in it. Just in a fantasy context, that seems weird, but it was not any particular drag on the show. And in fact, ironically, the part of the episode I liked the most was the section that was following Arendelle, the elf's storyline. Now, the real problems that I found with it are the writing, obviously. The dialogue at times kind of reminded me a bit of Star Trek Discovery and Star Trek Picard, in that they were trying a little too hard to have big epic speeches and poetic moments, which they haven't really earned yet. And the dialogue just ends up coming across as just kind of stilted and hollow and doesn't really mean anything, but it's trying to sound like, oh, victory is the wine of the grapes of truth of the moon. Just the sea of stars is what beckons me, and only by touching the light can you know the darkness inside your soul that is the light. It's a bunch of just kind of ring around hollow nothingness in terms of dialogue, and you need to earn those moments. You can't start off with it. The plot itself, what plot is there? I mean, I kind of miss, I get the idea that, of serialized storytelling over the course of the season, a greater story arc goes along, but I kind of miss the days where there was some sort of self-contained story theme within an episode. Everything just is basically just 8 and 9 hour long movies that are just chopped up into hour-long chunks and then put on television. Without any real breathing room in between them, or story beats in between them, for the vast majority of stuff being made. And this seems to be another example of that. It's really just the opening preamble for a 10-hour movie, or however many episodes are supposed to be in this season. And in some ways it kind of reminded me a little bit of Anne Rice's The Witching Hour. That was a book that I didn't finish reading because I was about a good 100 or so pages into it, and it still hadn't given me any sort of plot hook to care. It was just bouncing back and forth between characters I have no relation to or no idea of why they're relevant to each other. And I'm sure after reading the whole thing and then going back to the beginning, it might make more sense. But at some point, you actually have to give the audience some sort of hook to actually want to pay attention. That's why I liked the Arendelle section, because at least there was some sort of hook there. The stuff with him and that Bronwyn lady was way over telegraphed and kind of came across as a bit cheesy. But at least because of having established that, when they have a cut scene about her son, it makes more sense and it has more stakes, because he's been introduced and you know why he's relevant to someone else. If something goes bad with him, this lady's going to be sad, so on and so forth. Galadriel as the main character might have been a mistake. Certainly have her in there, but she just comes across as unlikable. The idea that this is part of a greater character arc, that by the Third Age and the time of the Lord of the Rings she's mellowed out, and all that kind of stuff is all well and good, but since that's thousands of years away and is not going to be included in this show, it's kind of a non-existent character arc for her, and instead she just kind of comes across as unreasonable and a little too much up her own ass, to borrow a turn of phrase from my wife. What I would have done is, instead of doing all this jumping around, and the hobbits, I know we're supposed to call them Harfoots, but the hobbits were all right, but without knowing exactly how they're supposed to be relevant to the greater plot, considering that part of the point of the Lord of the Rings is that the hobbits just kind of came out of nowhere to save the day. The idea that they've had any sort of involvement in the movements of history of the earlier age kind of flies in the face of that, I feel. And that's why I'm hoping that this thing at the end of the episode, with the guy falling from the sky in a meteor, they're pulling a double fake, and it actually is Gandalf, because it would also kind of, I feel, somewhat break the setting if Sauron met hobbits that early on, but then he just completely overlooks them later and is just seemingly unaware of their existence, even though they're the ones who helped him out of the hole when he first crashed. I don't know. I'd rather see that turn out to be Gandalf than the other way around. But I would have started off with Arendelle and had largely just followed him throughout the episode, and then through dialogue, when he's talking with his, commander, and they're talking about how the war is going to end, then you cut to Lindon and Elrond and Galadriel and Gil-galad and all their scenes. You can use some flashbacks to establish Galadriel's backstory and why she has the attitude she has. Give us more of a chunk of exactly what this thing that Arendelle and Bronwyn were off to go do. Because, we don't know a lot of these characters yet. Even if you might, know them from Lord of the Rings lore, you don't really know exactly how they're relevant to this particular story they've concocted. You need someone that you can immediately ride into the story where you kind of already know what the vibe is. That's why I feel like Arendelle should have been the thing, because opening up with him walking into a bar, it's your classic fantasy opening. It's the silent gunslinger motif that we've seen in tons of Clint Eastwood movies and Western novels and even The Mandalorian. It's not horribly original, but the audience recognizes what's going on, and so they don't need to know a ton about who this guy is to know he's the quiet badass that just rolled into town, and he's going to end up saving everyone's ass even though they mistrust him, and yada yada yada. It's familiar enough ground that you know what to hook yourself on, and since he actually has some sort of mystery to solve with this black cow milk thing going on, and like I said, the details of it aren't great, but at least there is a hook there. Whereas just the Galadriel scenes, I don't know, they're off-putting. And that wasn't just me as a sexist, misogynist man. My sexist, misogynist wife also didn't really seem to like Galadriel much. So we'll just have to see how that develops as time goes on. But, they need to establish reasons to cut away to other things, so that it feels like it's a relevant development and you're not just bouncing back and forth between all these random people that you don't even know yet. They should have just picked one person to hinge the episode around, and it should not have been Galadriel. They should have left more of her stuff mysterious to slowly spool out. Instead, it's just, anger, rage chick, making expressions like someone who's, annoyed that their Starbucks barista, did their latte wrong. She's a bit too wafy. I don't know why it is that for some reason, female actresses are not expected to do any working out to try to make themselves look muscular enough to, be doing all these sorts of action sequences. I will at least say that Galadriel didn't do that thing that's been prevalent in a lot of female action characters over the last couple of decades, where the Black Widow thing, where the lady will jump up on the dude's shoulders and jam her pussy in his face and then break his neck. At least there was none of that. I just don't know why only Galadriel and Legolas have the super elf powers, and the rest of the elves just kind of stand around and die real easily. What's going on with these two, where they're able to do all this ninja shit and surf around on shields downstairs, and do like a triple backflip spinning neck slice at a ice troll and all this kind of stuff. The opening sequence with the ice trail really reminded me a lot of like your introductory D&D scenario where they're exploring a cave and then they all got to fight a monster. And in fact, in many ways, like throughout a lot of it, I really felt like like I'm watching some sort of Dungeons and Dragons show. And if it had been a Dungeons and Dragons show without all the Lord of the Rings baggage with it, it'd probably be like a lot more regarded as like, oh my God, this is fantastic. How could we have possibly have gotten a D&D show this good? But it's not. It's tied itself to an incredibly high bar of excellence, and it's gonna take some time to ever crawl out of that shadow. Also, if the show ever does actually take hold, after a couple years, the fact that they've named it The Lord of the Rings of Power is going to seem dumber and dumber, because it should just be able to be itself, just be the Rings of Power. So, yeah, I guess that's, like, about all I really have to say about it. It's not as bad as some people are making it out to be. It was pointless, and we should have gotten a Silmarillion show. I understand why, like for branding recognition purposes, they want to have something that's got characters people might recognize, and Sauron this and Sauron that. But doing the Silmarillion would have, had plenty of things that hint and set up at events that would come to fruition by the time of the Lord of the Rings. But also, because of being about the war over the Silmarils and all that kind of stuff, and having a different villain, it would have actually been something different and unique to itself. And like another thing my wife commented on when we were watching it is that, like, her problem with a lot of prequels is that, well, we know where this is all going. We know they're going to defeat Sauron, but that he's going to come back. We know how all the pieces are going to end up. It's kind of probably the same problem that House of the Dragon has, although I haven't gotten around to watching that one yet. I guess that'll be next on the list. But the Silmarillion was further detached from the events, different characters, different villain, different goals and objectives. So I don't know. To have spent this much money to acquire, the Lord of the Rings and be able to make a show about the Lord of the Rings that's this expensive, and yet having not actually secured all the rights to it to produce the actual written stories, so that they're forced to have to just kind of cobble something together with a few little scattered details out of the appendices, and the fact that they can't even call their hobbits and have to do this off-brand shit, and then you have this new class of fake Tolkien experts out there on the internet who are like, running interference for this corporation trying to convince people that, the Harfoots are just, progenitors of the hobbits and all that. And like, no. Back before the Lord of the Rings movies came out, when I was a little kid, The Hobbit was like the first book I was like aware of as a book. I remember being a fan of like the Rankin Bass cartoons and playing around pretending to be Frodo when I was like 4. The Lord of the Rings novels were some of the first real, adult novels I ever tried to read, albeit like I was like 8 or 9, so the first couple times I read them, I mostly just followed the Hobbit parts when you got to the Two Towers and Return of the King, and it wasn't until I was a bit older that I'd actually would pay attention to the half of those books that were about Aragorn and his adventures. But there was a time in my life where I had a lot of Lord of the Rings lore and information in my brain. I once won a Trivial Pursuit Lord of the Rings game and stuff, but because of the movies, as much as I admired them and their quality, they did something that kind of spoiled my ability to enjoy the written works. After the movies had come out, the next time I had tried to read The Lord of the Rings again, instead of having what my own visual, impressions of what things are supposed to look like it was characters and scenes from the movies instead, and I didn't like that. And so, in my youth, I used to read these things at least once a year, but since the movies have been out, I made myself read The Hobbit once, and that's about it. And that's sad, and unfortunately, after 20 years, some of that, like information in my noggin has, kind of faded away just because you're just not engaging with it, and you're thinking about other things and remembering other things and all that kind of stuff. But I'm pretty fucking sure The halflings were largely unknown to everyone. Gollum wasn't a Harfoot, and they better not try to jam Gollum into this somehow, because the timing of things, he should have been much more later in the second era. Like he didn't pop up until like well after Isildur and the end of the first War of the Ring and all that kind of stuff. So hopefully we're not going to have Smeagol as one of the Harfoot characters in a later season or something. That would be pretty lame. But man, they love that branded, recognizable IP, so I wouldn't put it past them if they eventually did something like that. I don't know. That's just speculation on my part. So, but anyway, there's the show there's salvageable things about it. It could be good. It could have been good, and it's not terrible. It just they needed quit trying so hard. They're trying too hard, and it comes across that way. Like I said, it's similar to the CBS Plus, Paramount Plus All Access Star Treks, like Picard, where just the dialogue is just trying so hard to capture this sweeping emotional feeling of poetry and an epic thought and these profound words that are going to resonate with the audience and make you change your life, and they don't, because there's not any real substance to it. They haven't built up to earn these moments yet, and so you can't just open off with that kind of shit. They should have just stuck with the Black Elf and just run his storyline and then introduce other characters as it becomes appropriate to what he's engaging with during the course of that episode, if not the entire series, but at least through the first episode. We needed a better anchor than Galadriel. Also, it is kind of weird. I've heard other people mention it is kind of weird how characters are just talking whatever their normal accent is, but then when they say Galadriel, it's like, yeah, man, I'm just chilling out with my friends, just watching some TV and some beer. Oh, and here's my friend Galadriel. She's cool and all. It's just weird how this urge to put this little extra twist on how they're saying Elvish names, and they could just say Galadriel. They don't have to be Galadriel, every fucking time, especially when it doesn't match the rest of how they're talking. Also, there's quite a few scenes where the accents, it's my own problem. It's part of why I don't watch a ton of British television, for instance, because 1 out of 3 words I can't quite tell what the fuck they're saying. At least with the advantage to the elf scenes in Linden is that, well, at least Elrond and Galadriel are enunciating their words properly, but there's other stuff where it's like, yeah, I could go to England and watch Welsh television if I don't want to understand what anyone's saying in the show that I'm trying to figure out. You're trying to orient yourself to what's this setting? Who are these characters? Why do I care about them? And that's made harder when Sauron. Well, sort of Galadriel. I just, yeah, I don't know. Maybe there's really nothing to do about that, and that one's probably more on me than it is on them. But still, consistent, clear, easy to understand dialogue is helpful when you're trying to get your show off the ground. And that's it. Until next time, stay waspinated.